The horses of the 2014 Kentucky Derby. Where are they now? Let's find out. Coming in 19th and last was Vickers In Trouble. After a tough draw and a tougher trip in the Derby, Vickers In Trouble hit the Flyover State Derby circuit, winning the Grade 2 Super Derby and hitting the board in the Iowa, Indiana, and West Virginia Derbies. His final race came in that year's Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile, where he pushed eventual winner Golden Sense for a half mile until he faltered to last and was vanned off. He came out of the race with a condylar fracture in his left front leg, and there were hopes to stand him at stud in Louisiana after surgery to repair it. But he developed laminitis and he was euthanized in March of his 4-year-old season. Finishing 18th was Wildcat Red. He won his comeback start after the Derby in the Quality Road Stakes. Then he finished third in the Haskell Invitational and the Oklahoma Derby before being named Florida Bred Horse of the Year in 2014. He stuck around for 3 years after his sophomore season and never quite found his pre-Derby groove again. He spent his 6-year-old season in the UAE after being purchased by Sheikh Rashid bin Hamad Al Numani, but he got blown out in 2 starts. He retired with $1.1 million in earnings. He came back stateside and sold as a stallion prospect for $45,000 at the 2017 Keeneland November sale, going to Doug Arnold of Buck Pond Farm in Lexington, Kentucky. He's had 2 stakes winners at stud, one in Ohio and one in Alberta, from 20 lifetime starters. Running 17th was Vincent Ramos. Vincent Ramos never ran in a stakes race again after the Derby. He got claimed in Saratoga for $25,000, then he settled in at Parks Racing for the rest of his career, where he won a couple starter allowance races and he was claimed 2 more times, once at $12,500 and again at $10,000. He was gelded somewhere along the way too. After being given to some volunteer rehomers on the Parks backstretch, Vincent Ramos was purchased by his breeder, Kerry Brogdon of Mockmer Hall in Kentucky, for $1,000 and he was retired. He came to her in pretty rough shape after nursing a suspensory injury, among other things. After some rest and rehab though, he's living out his days in the gelding field at Mockmer Hall. Finishing in 16th was Harry's Holiday. Harry's Holiday was entered for the Ohio Derby for his comeback start, but he never made it to the gate and instead spent the rest of 2014 on the shelf. He came back in January of his 4-year-old season and he ran sparingly throughout the year in allowance optional claiming races before hanging them up at the end of the season. His best effort during that comeback year was a 2nd in Indiana. After he retired, Harry's Holiday stood 1 season at Justice Farm in Kentucky before relocating to Indiana. He currently stands at Breakaway Farm in Dillsboro, Indiana, and he was the state's leading sire by progeny earnings in 2022. He's leading that race again in 2023. Running 15th was Tapiture. Tapiture took a step back in distance and competition after the Derby, and he found his level in his next 2 starts, winning the Grade 3 Matt Winn Stakes and the West Virginia Derby. Then he finished out the year with runner-up efforts in the Pennsylvania Derby and the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile. He won the Grade 3 Ack Stakes at 4, and he was retired after another run at the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile with earnings of $1.5 million. Tapiture retired to Darby Dan Farms in Lexington, Kentucky for the 2016 breeding season, and he's become an incredibly dependable sire of winners and runners with top horses including Grade 3 winners Repo Rocks and Hopeful Growth, and multiple Grade 1 placed Jesus' team. In 14th place was Uncle Sigh. He didn't run again in 2014 after the Derby, but the New York bred had a long career when he returned to the track, competing on the state bred circuit. He never ran in another graded stakes race, but he became a dependable allowance optional claiming level horse. He was sold privately in the summer of his 4-year-old season after owner Chip McEwen became ill, and he ended up being claimed 7 times for prices between $25,000 and $40,000. He won 6 times after the Derby, and he even picked up a stakes placing at age 7. Uncle Sigh retired at age 8 with over $640,000 in the bank, and he was sent to Rerun, a retraining and adoption farm in New York, where he was eventually adopted out to his current home in Florida, where he babysits yearlings and weanlings. Finishing in 13th was Candy Boy. Candy Boy reemerged that summer and ran 2nd in the Los Alamitos Derby and the West Virginia Derby. Then he ran 3rd in the Pennsylvania Derby and finished the year running 6th in the Breeders' Cup Classic. Ahead of his 4-year-old campaign, Candy Boy was purchased by Ramzan Kadyrov, head of the Chechen Republic. He ran twice in the Dubai World Cup, finishing 4th in 2015, and he ran his last race at age 5. He retired in 2018 to stand in Russia. In 12th place was Intense Holiday. Tough story with this one. Intense Holiday was training for a start in the Belmont Stakes when he suffered a condylar fracture in his right front leg. He underwent surgery 2 days later, but he developed laminitis in both of his front legs, and after a few weeks of trying to turn it around, he was ultimately euthanized. In 11th place was General A-Rod. After the Derby, he went on to finish 4th in the Preakness Stakes and 7th in the Belmont before taking the rest of the year off. He returned to softer competition at age 4, winning the Challenger Stakes in his second start back. After he dabbled in a little bit of everything from dirt to turf and from graded stakes company to optional claimers, he retired in 2016 with earnings over $500,000. He retired to Hidden Springs Farm in Indiana for the 2018 breeding season. He's still looking for his first stakes winner at stud, but 5 of his first 7 starters have been winners. Finishing 10th was Miss Arty. After the Derby, the Ontario-bred Miss Arty established himself as a favorite in the Queen's Plate after winning the Plate Trial Stakes. But then he reared at the start of the big race itself, and he ran a flat 4th. The Queen's Plate was Miss Arty's final start. He missed the rest of his 3-year-old year, and he tried staging a comeback at 4, but he never made the races again. He retired to stud in Ontario for a couple seasons, then he stood at Ramsey Farm for 4 years before selling at the 2020 Keeneland November sale for $6,500. He last stood at Red Feather Equine in New Mexico, where he resided for 1 season before dying of colic in 2021. Miss Arty never quite got his due at stud with all the moving around, but he did sire Arty's Princess, who was named Canada's champion female sprinter of 2020. In 9th place was Chu Chu. Chu Chu got a long break after the Derby, and he came back in October of his 3-year-old season to win the Damascus Stakes and run 3rd in the Grade 1 Malibu Stakes. He came out of the Malibu with an ankle issue that they spent some time trying to get right, but his connections weren't confident that he could come back and compete at the same level, so he was retired with just under $600,000 in earnings. Chu Chu entered stud at Bridlewood Farm in Florida for the 2016 breeding season, where he's been serviceable on the Florida bred scene and he's had some fast workers at the breeze shows, but he's never really broken out from the pack. He has 1 stakes winner from 105 starters. Running 8th was Medal Count. Medal Count came back to finish 3rd in the Belmont Stakes, and then after being soundly beaten in the Haskell, he moved to the turf to finish 2nd in the Dueling Grounds Derby. He finished 7th in the Grade 1 Joe Hirsch Turf Classic Stakes. Then he was off for 9 months before making a 2-start comeback that really went nowhere. He retired with just under $500,000 in earnings. Medal Count entered stud at Spendthrift Farm in Lexington, Kentucky for the 2016 breeding season, and he stood there until 2020 when he relocated to Mapleton Thoroughbred Farm in Ohio. After 2 seasons in Ohio, he was pensioned from stud duty and rehomed through new vocations. Medal Count never really took off at stud. He never got a stakes winner, and he only has 1 stakes place runner, and that came in the Dominican Republic. Finishing 7th was Ryon Kurlin. Ryon Kurlin finished a surprise 2nd in the Preakness Stakes, but he didn't have a 1.5 miles in him, and he was eased in the Belmont Stakes. That was it for his 3-year-old season, but Ryon Kurlin came back to win an allowance optional claiming race in his comeback start at 4. That would be his final win, but he'd run steadily in stakes competition over the next 2 seasons, mostly at Oaklawn Park and the Fairgrounds, retiring at age 5 with $750,000 in earnings. Ryon Kurlin entered stud at Pleasant Acres Stallions in Florida for the 2017 breeding season. He hasn't been a total world beater at stud, but multiple stakes winner Coffee with Chris did run in this year's Preakness Stakes, and he's had a Grade 3 place runner in Uncle Boogie. Today, he's living out his days as a pensioner on his owner's farm. In 6th place was Dance with Fate. Sad story here. Dance with Fate went back to the West Coast after the Derby, and he was pointing toward the Grade 2 San Diego handicap at Del Mar that summer when he bolted and crashed through a fence while training. He suffered ligament tears to his right rear leg in the accident, and he was euthanized when it was determined that the injury couldn't be repaired. Coming in 5th was Samrat. Samrat finished 5th in the Belmont Stakes to finish up his 3-year-old campaign, and after winning his first 5 career starts, the horse never really found that mojo again in future campaigns. Samrat came back to run once at age 4. Then he had a more consistent campaign at 5, including runner-up efforts in the Grade 2 Suburban Handicap and the Grade 3 Westchester Stakes. However, that season ended with another 10-month layoff, and after 1 more start at 6, he was retired with earnings of $1 million. After his racing career, Samrat was pointed for the 2019 Retired Racehorse Project's Thoroughbred Makeover, and he was set to compete in the freestyle division, but he had to scratch just before the event. In 4th place was Wicked Strong. Wicked Strong had a solid career after the Derby, which started with a dead heat for 4th in the Belmont Stakes. Then he had a nice Saratoga meet with a win in the Grade 2 Jim Dandy Stakes and a 2nd by a nose in the Traverse. He clipped heels and lost his rider in the Jockey Club Gold Cup, and his connections decided to wrap him up for the year after that. Wicked Strong came back to run in the handicap division at age 4, and though he never won again, he was usually in the mix, including a 2nd in the Jockey Club Gold Cup just a year after losing his rider in the same race. His final start came in the 2015 Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile, where he finished 4th. Wicked Strong retired to Spendthrift Farm in Kentucky for the 2016 breeding season, and he's done okay for himself, getting a couple Grade 2 winners and a handful of stakes winners. He was relocated to Pin Oak Lane Farm in Pennsylvania for the 2021 season, where he resides today. Coming in third was Danza. The Derby was the final start for Danza, who came out of the race poorly and was benched for the rest of the year. He was being pointed toward the Don Handicap to kick off his 4-year-old campaign, but that never really got off the ground, and he was retired to Spendthrift Farm in Lexington, Kentucky for the 2016 breeding season. He stood there until 2020 when he was moved to Fair Winds Farm in Ohio, where he stood for 2 seasons before dying of an apparent heart attack in 2021. Danza honestly did better than I remembered at stud. He had a few stakes winners and even had a Group 2 winner in Panama. It was time for him to move to a regional market when he did, but he did alright for himself. The runner-up in the 2014 Derby was Commanding Curve. After closing from near last in the Derby, Commanding Curve got a lot of buzz as a horse that could end up relishing the added distance in the Belmont Stakes. He ended up finishing 9th. He ran in the Jim Dandy and Travers Stakes and missed the board in both to finish his 3-year-old season. Then he came back at 4 with an allowance win at Churchill Downs. He made a couple more stakes starts at 4 and ran 7th in both. Then he ran 3 times as a 5-year-old and things didn't get much better. Commanding Curve retired at the end of that season with earnings of more than $600,000. After his racing career, he entered training with Olympic-level 3-day event rider Philip Dutton. He's proven quite versatile in his new endeavor, competing in shows around the country and winning his fair share of them. You'll love to see it. The winner of the 2014 Kentucky Derby was California Chrome. California Chrome swept up the public's imagination during his Triple Crown run, where he won the Preakness Stakes, then dead heated for 4th at his try for history in the Belmont Stakes. After running 6th in the Pennsylvania Derby, California Chrome secured 2014 Horse of the Year honors with a 3rd in the Breeders' Cup Classic and a win on the turf in the Hollywood Derby. California Chrome looked primed to have a big year in 2015 after finishing 2nd in the San Antonio Stakes and the Dubai World Cup, but then things kind of fell apart. He was sent to England to run in the Prince of Wales' Stakes at Royal Ascot, but he scratched a few days before the race with a hoof bruise. Then he came back to the US to run in the Arlington Million, but a cannon bruise ended his season. After nearly a year off, he came back with fire in 2016, winning the Grade 2 San Pascal as a prep to eventually win the Dubai World Cup. When he came back stateside, he rolled out wins in the San Diego Handicap, the Pacific Classic, and the Awesome Again Stakes before finishing 2nd by a half length to Arrogate in the Breeders' Cup Classic. It was enough for him to earn his 2nd Horse of the Year title in 2016. California Chrome raced once at 6 when he was off the board in the Pegasus World Cup Invitational, before retiring to TaylorMade Stallions in Kentucky and shuttling to the Southern Hemisphere seasons in Chile. He ended his career with earnings of more than $14 million. He was a massive fan favorite at TaylorMade, and the farm really upped its game to host fans that came to see him. Unfortunately, his performance at stud couldn't live up to that hype. In America, he turned out to be more of a turf sire, with 2 of his 3 graded winners coming on the grass, all in Grade 2 competition. He did really well in Chile, though, where his runners included Chilean 2000 Guineas winner Chromium. California Chrome was sold to stand in Japan ahead of the 2020 breeding season, residing at Arrow Stud. The California Chrome syndicate that stood him in America has a right of first refusal if his Japanese owners ever want to sell the horse, and either way, California Chrome will be repatriated to the US to live out his days as a pensioner at the end of his stud career. For more horse racing news, visit pollockreport.com.